October 17th, 1973, Washington, D.C. The United States was entering the third week of a growing oil crisis. Arab members of OPEC had announced an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel. Within days, crude oil supplies became a weapon of economic pressure. The crisis began during the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The United States supplied Israel with military assistance, and Arab oil producers responded by restricting exports. Then the price of oil began to move sharply upward. For countries built around cheap petroleum, this changed the calculation overnight. By November, production cuts and embargoes were reshaping energy markets far beyond the Middle East. American drivers began waiting in long lines at gasoline stations. Some stations ran out of fuel entirely. The shortage was not simply a problem at the pump. Oil was connected to transportation, manufacturing, heating, electricity, and food production. Because of this, the price shock moved through the wider economy. In the United States, inflation accelerated while economic growth weakened. The period became associated with a combination that policymakers found particularly difficult: rising prices and slowing output. Europe faced its own disruptions. Several governments introduced measures to reduce fuel consumption. In the Netherlands, motorists experienced car-free Sundays. In the United States, the federal government introduced a national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit as part of a broader attempt to conserve gasoline. But the crisis was not only about scarcity. It was also about power. For decades, industrial economies had depended heavily on petroleum, while many of the world's largest oil reserves were concentrated in countries outside those consuming economies. The embargo demonstrated what could happen when producers coordinated their control over supply. OPEC had existed since 1960, but the events of 1973 showed that its influence could reach directly into the daily lives of millions of people. Then the political balance began to change. Oil-producing states accumulated enormous revenues as prices rose. Governments that had previously relied on Western financial systems gained greater economic leverage. The money flowing from consumers to producers became one of the defining financial movements of the decade. Western governments responded by changing energy policy. The United States created new institutions and programs aimed at reducing dependence on imported oil. Strategic petroleum reserves became part of the national security calculation. Energy efficiency became a political issue. Alternative sources of energy received greater attention. The crisis also changed the relationship between oil and global finance. Petrodollars, the revenues earned by oil exporters from selling petroleum, began circulating through international banks and financial markets. Some of that money was deposited in Western financial institutions and then lent onward to governments and companies. This created new connections between oil wealth, banking, sovereign finance, and global debt. The consequences continued after the embargo itself ended. Oil prices remained far higher than they had been before the crisis, and the global economy had to adjust to a new energy environment. The crisis also demonstrated that a geopolitical conflict in one region could produce economic consequences across continents within weeks. In 1973, oil had been treated by many consumers as an ordinary commodity. After the crisis, it was harder to see it that way. It was a strategic resource, a source of government revenue, a financial asset, and a tool of political pressure. The world had learned how vulnerable an economy could become when its energy system depended on a single resource. And the next shock was already waiting.